While remaining in meditation, I'm going to read these words of Yogananda. Let's tune into them and feel him sharing this with us now. What is life? Life is a wave of electrons and atoms, a wave of protoplasm, a wave of power, a wave of consciousness. Life is intelligent. It is organized motion. It becomes a clod of earth or itself melts into vapor, becomes a human being or a corpse. Stones, living beings, dead creatures, or waves in the ocean of life. There is no death nor cessation of motion in anything. Everything is living. A wave is born, it rises to its supreme height, then falls or dies to rise again somewhere. The birth of the baby is the beginning, the youth the crest, and the death the fall of the wave in the infinite ocean of life. Before and after death, the soul rolls on as the wave of life and intelligence, but not as the wave of condensed electrons of which the body is composed. The body is shaped after the waves of life and intelligence. It behaves in exact accordance with the quality and the measure of their power. If life is eternal motion, then why does death visit the human body? This is the great question. Death is not cessation nor annihilation, for even matter is indestructible. Matter is life. Life is matter. Life is intelligence. Matter is sleeping intelligence. Since matter is indestructible, so also all life is indestructible. Om. Peace. Amen. Where did this come from? Let's see. It's from one of the earlier writings. I think it's from East West. It's an article titled The Mystery of Life and Death from 1928. I think it's his writing. It's not just a transcription of a talk.
And here you say matter is indestructible?
Yes. Yes. Matter cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. Yeah. I mean, matter itself cannot be destructed. It can be made from A to B, but it cannot be taken out of existence, or it can become energy. That's physics. What an interesting topic. I taught a class on this subject a few years ago, and I was actually quite blown away by the amount of literature that Master wrote on death and dying itself, just on the process of death. And I was also blown away because until I actually started studying and looking for it, I had not read most of it. And the specificity with which he talks about death and how much he focused on it in his writings and teachings is quite something to take note of. And in these 4 weeks, we will see what all and how we get to explore all of it. But, because there's so much subject matter, and I'm sure whatever we are meant to talk about will come up. But it is certainly an extremely important and interesting topic to explore. And, as I was thinking about it, it also became clear to me for all of us, in a strange way, I thought about it, that if death was not a part of human life, spirituality wouldn't be either, in a strange way, because it is one of the deepest and the truest questions of human existence itself. Does everything stop existing when you die? And quite apart from where people identify on the spectrum of believer, non-believer, atheist, agnostic, everybody has to answer that question. You can not have an opinion about God, but you have to have an opinion about life because we watch it. There is this incident from the Mahabharata. Many of you may have heard about this. I won't go into the entire story, but the Pandava brothers, who are the good guys, are in exile in the forest. And there is this incident where the four brothers, except Yudhishthira, the younger four brothers, they go to this lake to drink water and they die. They die because this lake is poisoned by this mysterious astral entity who will not allow anybody to take its waters. And then Yudhishthira also goes and he immediately understands what's happening here. And he tells this entity that I want my brothers back. And then immediately this person says, then I have to ask you questions. Actually, I skipped part of the story. He went through this dialogue with all the four brothers too before they all died. But anyway, that's not the point. So there is this whole quiz that happens between this person who's called the Yaksha and Yudhishthira, where Yudhishthira is being tested. It is the god of Dharma himself, the god of righteousness. He is trying to test Yudhishthira to see if he is truly ready to take on the assignment of his life. And then there is many, many questions he asks. I won't go into all of that, but the question that I wanted to mention in this context as we talk about death is this one question the Yaksha asks Yudhishthira. He says, what is the greatest wonder in all of universe? And Yudhishthira's answer to that is, everybody is met with death every day of their lives, and yet they live their lives as if they are immortal. You know, death is just everywhere, whether or not we are losing members of our family. We see a tree dying, you know, we see an ant dying, we see things dying. It's just the most immutable, unchanging part of life itself is death. And yet, we live lives as if, what does that mean, we live lives as if we are immortal? It just means that we are completely preoccupied with the pursuit of whatever it is that we are trying to make happen here, that we are not constantly guided by the thought of death. And Yudhishthira says that's the greatest wonder of all of life itself, that somehow the only thing that is happening here is not the thing that we take note of, or is not constantly guiding all our thoughts and actions. So, you know, it is interesting to even think about how, you know, this question of death, and more importantly, whether life stops existing. And you get to watch it in many ways. I mean, quite apart from whether people consider themselves spiritual, religious, what they believe in, identify with, I'm sure all of us have seen this. I'll share a couple of stories which I was thinking about today as I was preparing. But you get to watch how people face it. Most obviously with the death of others, because we all go through it on a personal level only once. We don't get more than one turn unless you come back from the other side. For the most part, we actually get to die only once. But we get to live through this because we all lose people from our lives. They just stop existing. There's somebody and then they are not. And then we get to really, really, really go deep and dive into this question. What do I think happened here? Did this person really stop existing? Quite apart from what I've been told, what I've read, what I believe in, what really happened here? Do I know what happened? There is this very interesting thing that happened in my life. I'll share more stories, and I'm sure we'll all have opportunity, hopefully, in these 4 weeks. You know, there are a lot of stories of how I was thinking of times in my life I faced death, not personally, but death of others that I knew or close to my family. But this was a death of somebody that was not even very close to me personally. So this was a friend of mine many, many years ago, maybe 20 years ago, a long time ago. And I think I might have just graduated college. And this was a friend of mine who was visiting me. And he was visiting from a different town. And he was visiting me where I was. And we met somewhere, and we had an afternoon snack at a restaurant. And he left his bag there. He forgot. And we both went away. And then he called me back once he had left. You know, I've already left. Can you please go get my bag and keep it with you? And so I did. And he left his body within 4 days. And I did not, actually. So I called the restaurant, and I told them, you know, my friend left his bag there. I want to come collect it. And I was going to then go to the restaurant whenever I had the chance. And by the time, before I had actually gone collected that bag, my friend had actually left his body. I mean, you can just think about it. There's nothing dramatic about that story. It just happens, except that somebody died. He was a young man. But then I was sitting with this question. Do I want to go collect this bag? What do I do with this? Should I give it to his parents? It was related to his work, so I really didn't think his parents cared about his work laptop or whatever else he had in his bag. I did choose to go get that bag. But then, he lived in a different, I got that bag from the restaurant. He lived in a different city. His parents lived somewhere. The bag was in my bedroom for many days. And then it was just this presence. I could feel him in every part. He was not personally that close to me. I was not grieving. I mean, it was sort of shocking that somebody you were having dinner with just left. But then, it was not anything deeply painful or, sad for me. But then I was just watching this bag. There was this person, what happened? And I can feel him in every part of that bag. I can feel him. I opened and saw what was there, all the things that he carried in his backpack, and it was all there. And, things like this happen all the time. I was thinking of one other instance. This was also somewhere long, long time ago. I had another friend. This girl, she had lost her mother. And I didn't even see this. But then she was talking about her process of grief and grieving, and she told me that she made a pillowcase out of her mother's sari. And she was describing to me how important and how precious it was for her to have that pillowcase made of her mother's sari, and how much it meant to her to have her mother with her every night as she went to bed. Anyway, it's not like one is related to another, but I was thinking of these two stories, not even ones where I was personally processing a lot, but just in terms of what do we hold on to even when somebody leaves? Are those just our feelings, or is there a reality that the person left behind that we are actually holding on to? What happens to that relationship when we do our astral ascension ceremony in Ananda? It is very beautifully written, obviously, and I just love the fact it starts with the word friend. Dear friend, you who have left before us, I'm sure many of you have heard this astral ascension ceremony read before. It is an interesting thought in itself to think about it, because it doesn't matter whether it's your mother, your spouse, your child, whoever has left, that relationship was through the body. They are not your mother anymore. They are not your son. They are not your brother. They are not your spouse. Now they are just a friend, because once they have disidentified with the body, the relationship also, in a way, stops existing. In a strange way. I mean, you are connected with your mother, but the soul that was the vehicle has actually moved on. It is just a strange thought to think about. And this is the question, that Master asks in that reading. That is the great question. Why does death visit us? And he also answers that in many of his writings. We'll come to that in a bit. But this question of what happens when you die, how do we process that, is so central to our spiritual life, because it is the essential question of all of life itself. Because we have to make up our mind about it. It cannot just be a figment of belief. It cannot be because I was taught so, because somebody said so. But we really have to know for ourselves what is really happening. This topic is so close to my heart also because I might have shared this in a setting some weeks ago. I don't know what class or what it was. I'm sure many of you have heard this book called The Tibetan Book of the Dead. Or nowadays I think people call it Tibetan Book of Living and Dying because it sounds better. But actually the book is called Bardo. It doesn't mean Tibetan Book of the Dead. It literally translates into liberation in the phase after death. How do you attain liberation when you're lingering between worlds? It's just an instructive book, and it's actually ceremonial. It's not a book. It is a ceremonial text that is recited as the body is laying there once the person has left. And it is offering clear guidance on how this person should navigate this space when they are transitioning from one plane to another. It's very beautiful. There are many translations on the internet that you can find. This was also many, many years ago, probably 20, I don't know, I'm trying to think when I graduated high school. This was probably around the time, I graduated high school. I might have just got into college. I was in college. And there was no YouTube, at least it was not as popular as it is now. Maybe it was there, I don't remember. Somebody had given me a DVD of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And I was watching this. I already had a desktop computer. I was watching this. I was a seeker even at that age. I was somehow looking for something. I didn't know what it was. And The documentary is there on the internet. You can watch. It's 30 years old. It's so dated that it's hard to watch that video. It looks very old. But you can easily find it on YouTube. This is a beautiful documentary, very powerful. I would highly recommend it. It's a documentary showing the Tibetan culture and how they work with the person when they leave their body. And there is one line, I'm paraphrasing, I didn't actually go back and check. Somewhere the narrator, who almost has this deep English voice, like how documentaries are generally, and he says, every time you die, it is an opportunity to be fully liberated. To be fully liberated. To actually overcome all limitations and to merge back in spirit. But we grieve when somebody dies. Every time you're born, it is because you were not successful the last time. But we celebrate birth. And he doesn't make, that's all he says. He moves on from there. There's no more commentary. He just says, every time you die, it is an opportunity. It is a doorway into something so much greater. But the only way we cope with it is grief. I mean, those who are left on this plane, who knows? All of us are here. We probably don't remember what happens for the person who's leaving because we don't hold that in our memory in the same way. And every time a soul is born. I mean, it is not to be cynical about life here. It's just an interesting perspective, sort of makes you pause and makes you think. That's all. It's not to say that now you should mourn the birth of a child, because it is a beautiful opportunity to be given a human incarnation and to have that opportunity to go through all of our unlearned lessons. But in the strangest of ways, I'm sure all of this is past karma, that sentence stuck with me. It influenced everything I did from that point on. It was sort of this spark that had been lighted, and from that point on, I just couldn't see life the same way, and everything else. I mean, so many things happened. It was probably 3 or 4 years from then that I read the autobiography of a yogi. But so much of what happened I can trace back to that moment when I was watching this documentary and I heard that line. I'm sure there were more lines in the documentary. Some other line may speak to somebody else. But, I wanted to share that because there is something about death and life and this transition that is so core to who we are and how we face it, and the need for us to reconcile and to ground ourselves in that reality is so fundamental to how we approach our spiritual life. There is no other way to it. Now, that was just a very lengthy introduction. What we will do over these 4 weeks, we will go through many themes and topics. I was first, when Saranya and I met, I was thinking about it. The first thing I told her was, I want this class to be about death and dying. I don't want to talk about grief. Because it's a whole other topic. It's a very different discussion. But I didn't share this with Saranya. But as I was meditating and reading a lot over these past 3 or 4 days, I realized they cannot be separated. They cannot be separated. Grief and death and dying cannot be separated. It doesn't mean, but I do want to approach it in this particular context in these next 4 weeks, that we come together from the lens of our own personal journey and transition. Because there is a lot that is to be said with emotional healing and how we cope with loss and grief outside. But also I realized the reason why I thought it cannot be separated, because you cannot actually we cannot grasp or wrap ourselves about the idea of change and mutation in our own life if we cannot also deal with grief. They are not actually separate or different. That's really what I realized. Although in my intellectual mind, somehow they seemed like they were two different parts of the same picture, I then realized they're not. They're actually the same picture. The way we grieve and the way we overcome loss is no different from the way we deal with mutation and change, and it is no different from the way we ourselves will face into our death when that moment comes to all of us. So it's not one or the other, but most likely in these next 4 weeks, I hope to approach it from that personal angle of our journey and working with our own psyche and ourself on how we can face into it. And this is, again, the strangest of spiritual conundrums, because this is where the theory and the practice diverge like this in the roads of consciousness. Because, I'm not this body. I'll share this story perhaps in a future class, but somebody who left their body many years ago, who was very, very close to me, And by this time, I was already at Ananda. I was already perhaps even teaching here. I was much more grounded in Master's teachings. And this person, when I was on phone with her, she kept telling me, I'm practicing this affirmation that I'm not this body. I'm practicing this affirmation that I'm not this body. And somehow, it is not right or wrong. It's not an objective judgment. But I felt to tell her at that moment, I think you need to stop doing that. I think you need to stop doing that. You're shocking yourselves and traumatizing yourself by constantly asserting this thought so much over everything that is happening for you right this moment. You don't have to say that. You just have to think of God. You just have to focus on your relationship with God and allow yourself to experience pain and loss and everything that you're going through. Yes, you're not the body. I'm not the body, but I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with that, because if I'm not the body, I probably wouldn't be experiencing the kind of pain, in that state. If she was not the body, she wouldn't be experiencing everything she's experiencing. So it almost becomes an affirmation that gets disconnected from the reality of who we are and what we are working with. I started saying that because they really diverge, theory and practice. Because death is one of those instances, dying itself is the process where, there are beautiful words that Master uses in the autobiography. I'll come to that in a bit. I think even Yukteswar Giri, I read a quote today in the autobiography of Yogi. I'm sure all of you know the story of Buddha, who was a prince that was kept away from all of reality in life, and then he walks out, and then he sees death, old age, and illness. And Yukteswar Giri quotes the same thing in the autobiography of a yogi. And then he says, this is what I love about how the book is edited and the way Master puts things. He says, old age, illness, and involuntary death. Involuntary death. He just doesn't say death, because involuntary death is what we are trying to overcome. We don't want to be yanked out of our bodies and shocked out of the system by Divine Mother, because we needed to learn more lessons and we just cannot move along in these bodies. We all want to have choice and mastery. So death in itself is not anything wrong or bad, but involuntary death is one of the miseries of being on the earthly plane. So as I was starting to say, in this first class, in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to share and read a lot of what Master shared about death and the astral world and the transition process itself, which I have to say, as I was studying, as I said, I was doing this many years ago for a different class. I was blown away the kind of detail and the specificity with which he was sharing, and I think it's very helpful. In the last class of this series, we'll also talk about helping others or working with others in the process. Even for that, this understanding is so essential of how he describes the process of dying. And then after that, I'll invite Saranya over to do some interesting activities with us. And we'll also talk about, in the next 3 weeks, some of the topics we'll touch on is the idea of, what do we do right now? How do we prepare? The idea of work, how does karma reflect in our lives? And the idea of working through those last stages and many other things that will all naturally come up. And of course, any other ideas, thoughts, comments any of you have to share. Even before, talking about death, we have to talk about birth. Because, as I said, even from the quote from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they're inseparable. And in a certain way, this is how Master describes it. I want to read most of it from his own writing because it's interesting and exciting to hear it in his words, but I'll also offer it in my own words because I haven't marked everything. But this is how Master describes it. The astral plane and the physical plane are very close to each other. And those of us who are not yet capable of being either fully awake permanently in the astral plane or transcending it over to the causal plane, we are in this endless cycle of coming onto the physical plane, going back to the astral plane, coming onto the physical plane, going back to the astral plane. A birth here is death on the astral plane. A death here is birth on the astral plane. So it is a cycle where, and that's what even that Tibetan word Bardo, it just means flow. We just sort of flow between these different dimensions of consciousness. We flow from one to another, and when we enter one of them, we immediately identify because there is ego left, and the ego starts to hold on to everything that it has now entered. And then now that identity starts to define us. When we enter the physical plane, whatever it is, it starts with the body itself, but then it extends beyond the body. As soon as the child is 4 years old, 10 years old, language, culture, relationships, likes, dislikes, all those identities that we hold on to, they start solidifying. And they become crummy and so solid that ultimately Divine Mother has to yank us out of it. There's this beautiful poem, this Bengali song. There are many songs of Ram Prasad, who was a great mystic poet from Bengal that Master really admired, and he translated many of his songs. And one of my favorite songs of Ram Prasad, this is not translated by Master, is I didn't know what these words meant. Then I used to sing this song, and then I asked somebody who explained the words to me. They were so beautiful. The song starts by describing the beautiful form of Kali in the most resplendent, just so beautiful to even look at. How her her earrings or her necklace, her form, her hair, how all of it is so beautiful and radiant and bright. He describes all of that. And then when he goes to the second or third stanza, he says, at the end of my life, you walk up to me in the form of death. And then he's describing this beautiful form of Kali, but what he's describing is death approaching in order to relieve him from this world. And Master also talks about it. So in a certain way, I said that because I kept saying Divine Mother has to yank us out of the body. But it is an act of compassion because she relieves us. She relieves us of how much we ourselves get rigid and solidified in the forms that we have identified with, that we reach our maximum capacity for making spiritual progress within that limitation. So in order for us to keep moving on, she has to take that form away. And then she gives us a new form, Again, it's not all that sad because it is also an act of compassion. We are constantly being cycled between these worlds because that is the only way in which we can grow. If we were stuck on either plane, then we will just solidify into a rock. We won't be moving. But in order for our consciousness itself to be fluid and continue to expand and grow, we have to come in and out and in and out. There's this wonderful exchange again in Conversations with Yogananda where, Norman and Master are having a conversation, and I won't go into the whole thing, but, Norman at one point asks, are there solar systems like ours, galaxies like ours, where we could reincarnate? Keep coming back to Earth? And then Master just says, of course, there's so many. You can reincarnate in a million other galaxies or solar systems and all of that. And then he says, if you came back to Earth all the time, you would find out too soon. In a way, that is also, if you think about it, an act of compassion, because even our memory is erased. We all wonder, we all wish, there is hypnotherapy, regression, and all those kinds of things these days. I would love to know what my past lives are, and, there are psychics who will tell you were this in this life and that in that life. But, if you pause and think about it, there is a reason why we don't know. Divine Mother designed it that way. Because if it was helpful for us to know, of course, I'm not saying these mediums and help can come to us in a way that could actually help us spiritually, but also inherently in the design, we are not given this knowledge because we are given this opportunity again to have a way to navigate whatever world we enter without needing to carry all those bags of context, all those bags of success and failures, and all of that has held us back so much that she needed to get us out of that body and now give us a new one. So I'll start with this. There's nothing political about this, in case it might sound like it, but that's not the point. It is simply this reading that I'm about to read. It's from Conversations with Yogananda. Someone asked Master, when does the soul enter the body? At the moment of conception, he replied, when the sperm and the ovum unite, there is a flash of light in the astral world. Souls there that are ready to be reborn, if their vibration matches that of the flash of light, rush to get in. Sometimes, two or more get in at the same time. And the woman has twins, triplets, or even, well, it is important, therefore, to come together physically with an uplifted consciousness. That flash generated in the astral world reflects the couple's state of consciousness, especially as they felt during the moment of physical union. So, as he says, the astral world, we enter the physical world just as that one spark that enters that sperm in the ovum. In fact, there is a different writing of Master, I think, or Swami, I think it is Master. He says that one cell, that again he talks at different places, it is the medulla. You know, that first cell, the zygote that is formed when the souls unite, is that one cell into which the consciousness enters, is the medulla. He says that cell continues to function till the individual leaves this body. I hope I'm not paraphrasing, but I think that's what I remember reading. Now, I want to share from, on the other side, what happens in the astral world. This chapter is something that, we all read in the autobiography of a yogi, but I find it to be one of the densest chapters in the whole book, The Resurrection of Sri Yukteswar. The amount of detail that Yukteswar Giri goes into explaining how things work in the astral world, how it's different from the physical, and then the causal, and what are the different kinds of astral world. It sounds like, what am I going to do with all of that? But then if you sit and think about all the things that he's saying, you realize how relevant it is, especially for the topic that we're discussing of death and how we move between worlds. Now, I'm just going to read sections and excerpts of this because, there's pages and pages of how Yukteswar Giri describes a lot of this, and this is chapter, what number is this? I recommend you to go back and read this from the autobiography of a yogi. It's called The Resurrection of Sri Yukteswar. It is towards the end of the book. Physical death is attended by the disappearance of breath and the disintegration of fleshly cells. Give me 1 second. I wanted to see which part I wanted to read. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. So it is really hard to select sections, but I'm going to read, lines here and there because I know I'm speaking to a room full of people who are fairly familiar with the book and some of these teachings, so I'm not going to read everything in sequence. When a soul finally gets out of the three jars of bodily delusions, physical, astral, and causal, it becomes one with the infinite without any loss of individuality. The undeveloped man must undergo countless earthly and astral and causal incarnations in order to emerge from his three bodies. The physical karma or desires of man must be completely worked out before his permanent stay in astral worlds become possible. Two kinds of beings live in the astral spheres: those who still have earthly karma to dispose of and who must therefore re-inhabit a gross physical body in order to pay back their karmic debts could be classified after physical death as temporary visitors to the astral world rather than as permanent residents. Beings with unredeemed earthly karma are not permitted after astral world to go to the higher causal sphere of cosmic ideas. After each loss of his physical body, however, I'm just skipping some sentences, but I'll explain. After each loss of his physical body, however, an undeveloped being from the earth remains for the most part in the deep stupor of the death sleep and is hardly conscious of the beautiful astral sphere. After astral rest, such a man returns to the material plane for further lessons, gradually accustoming himself through repeated journeys to the worlds of subtle astral texture. He's explaining a very important point, which we'll also continue to discuss next week. Again, it's not as coherent because I'm skipping lines in between. Yukteswar Giri is talking about two kinds of human beings themselves that enter the astral plane. And the one who is less developed, he says, for the most part, they remain in deep stupor of the death sleep, and they are not conscious of the beautiful astral sphere. When most people, and in fact, one way to think about it is when we are talking about subtle astral realm, and again, I don't know exactly where he says that. Oh, here, there you go. I'll read this, it'll be more clear. Just as most people on earth have not learned through meditation acquired vision to appreciate the superior joys and advantages of life, and thus after death desire to return to the limited, imperfect pleasures of life, so many astral beings during normal disintegration of their astral body fail to picture the advanced spiritual joy in the cosmic world, in the causal world, sorry. He's implying a lot of things here. Most earthly beings, he says, have not learned through meditation acquired vision to appreciate superior joys. So, what he's implying in the section I read before and in these lines, when one accustoms themselves through meditation to subtler realities, then they develop the ability also to awaken from the deep stupor of death when they enter the astral world. So, the undeveloped human being, when one has no context of meditation, when one has no context of how subtle realities work, if their entire relationship with the world is only through the senses and the emotional reactions that occur as an after effect of their karma and those interactions with the senses, they have no option but they go into a deep stupor when they die. They go to the astral world, but quite contrary from what we imagine that, everybody has to experience heaven or hell, what Yukteswar Giri is saying here is they actually don't experience anything. Because they are, in a way they're closer to animal realities because the astral world is too subtle for them to have experience at all. They just remain asleep until the power and the momentum of their desires, again as read in the previous reading, it pushes them to seek that spark when another sperm and ovum unite, whether it's human or not, to enter it again and to reanimate themselves on the physical plane because their whole reality and desires are so confined to the physical plane that they have no context for experiencing the subtler textures of astral life. And when we, those of us who have the opportunity to practice meditation, to practice techniques such as Kriya Yoga, what we are training ourselves to do is to become aware and sensitive on the level to experience meditation acquired vision and appreciate the superior joys of life. And when we learn to dissociate ourselves just from the physical body, but create a context for experience that is not confined to the body, then we develop the ability to experience and enjoy the astral world. So our ability to what we experience and what happens death is a direct consequence of how subtle our awareness and practices are when we are living in the body. That's really what Yukteswar Giri is stating in these readings. And I won't go into this further because there's a lot. As I said, it's very interesting. I would recommend this chapter very highly. Another way I've thought about it, or at least somebody shared with me, I remember, is for those that don't meditate, there is no context of awareness or experience that is independent of sensory processing through the brain, even quite physiologically speaking. So they feel obligated to go asleep when their brain dies because they are so far from being aware of any context of experience that is not just a neural reaction in their brain caused by an external stimuli. Now, when through meditation, we start to develop experiences in our astral spine that are not a direct function of just our physiological brain, then we are developing that context. And that context is really what animates us in the astral world. I hope all of this is not too complex. Is this making sense? Okay. I was not sure if, okay, now I'm going to move on quickly and just read a little bit. We may continue this next class also because this is obviously the core of everything we are discussing. Now, I'm going to read from this book. These are all from Precepta. It's just edited much better, and this book is called Karma and Reincarnation. So, Master describes the exact process of death. I don't think all of this requires a lot of commentary, so I'm just going to read it. The ordinary man at the time of death experiences the following sensations, and he is going in sequence. Gradual numbness of the limbs, muscles, heart, lungs, and diaphragm. The spreading of the numbness in the limbs and muscles, a sense of sadness, helplessness, and a desire to live come into the mind. When the numbness reaches the heart muscles, a sense of pain and suffocation is experienced, which causes an extreme fear of death. An attachment towards possessions and loved ones strongly comes upon the soul and causes extreme mental grief. What he is describing is the process of the prana, the life force itself, dissociating. The life force starts associating itself top to bottom. It enters through the medulla. Immediately, all the chakras are manifested. Immediately, just that tiny little comma of a cell, maybe a few hours after the conception, it already has the 7 chakras, because the astral spine has to be complete even for life force to flow and start animating that cell. And when the person leaves the body, it leaves in the opposite way. It starts dissociating from the root. The prana separates from the root, it separates from the sacral, from the lumbar, it just starts moving up. And again, even my own grandfather, who passed away when I was very young probably, it's a common thing. I don't know how many of you have heard this. People can see it, especially if the death is not... especially, if the death is not caused because of some kind of heavy deterioration of the body where bodily functions have already failed, or it's not sudden. With most natural causes, especially heart attack, you can actually watch. You can watch. I remember saying I was not with my grandmother when she passed away, but I do remember, I was probably 11 or 12 years old. I do remember, the bodily functions go and come back. And without any medical reason, the body just starts to respond and behave differently. Suddenly, they cannot animate their legs, they cannot animate their hands. It's almost like it's a part of them, but it's not. Like their legs are already dead, but their upper body is not dead yet. They're halfway in the process of dying. It's not even, when you see it happening, it almost is very clear. I'm sure many of you may have even had that experience watching. And when the prana leaves, it in fact, in cases of clear natural death at old age, it even flushes the bowels. Most often it is said in India, when you clean the person who just left their body, generally you have to also, there's a bowel movement that happens when the prana leaves through the sacral and the lumbar centers, because as it dissociates from each center in the body, you actually can even watch it. Sometimes it's too sudden, and sometimes it's not sudden at all because the person is sort of going in and out, which is actually very common. Again, any of you who have seen anybody die, that is also a very, very common occurrence, which is that rarely, again, unless the body is significantly deteriorated or it's a sudden death, most people actually, go in and out. They have glimpses of the other side, and then they are back. They are not yet ready to fully commit in either direction. They sort of linger back and forth, and sometimes even, that's why even near-death experiences happen, because you're lingering back and forth, and suddenly you're able to commit to this side, which is much more uncommon than committing to the other side. But all of this I'm sharing because there is a sequence in which the prana actually leaves the body. And as Master describes, there is emotions and feelings. Most often when this is discussed in the context of hospice or in the realities of things that we are watching, we only see the physical realities. But as he's describing here, there are specific emotions that come up. As your limbs start becoming numb, you experience extreme sadness. As it goes through your heart, as the prana is releasing from the heart center, You experience extreme fear of death. You experience attachment towards possessions and loved ones strongly, and you experience extreme mental grief. With the pain of suffocation, there is a great mental struggle to bring the breath back again. At this time, a condensed review of all good and bad actions of the lifetime come up in the mind of the dying man. From this mental introspection comes the guiding tendency in determining the kind of birth the dying man will have in the next life. It's very instructive. We'll go through all of this more in the next classes, so I'm not discussing each one. At this time, the senses of touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing vanish in succession. Touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. So hearing, as I'm sure many of you already know, is the last sense that leaves the body. Again, he says, the sense of hearing is the last to leave the consciousness of the dying man. That is why it is extremely unwise even to whisper within the hearing of a dying man, all is over, he is about to die. It can be very shocking for the soul because you could have told him 3 hours ago, but in that moment, it will be different because the person is struggling. And that's why, again, there's an article I forgot to print. I'll print it for everybody next week. It's called The Final Exam by Swami Kriyananda. It's a beautifully written article, and there's a Q&A. And when he talks about, that's why in the Indian tradition, in Sanatana Dharma, cremation is what is recommended for most people. Because, theory and practice diverge when it comes to this topic. The person has left, but his attachment to that body has not fully left. That death becomes solid. It becomes... the deal is finalized when that body just goes into ash. Because otherwise, the soul lingers. The soul can linger. The soul can linger around those physical realities. It might struggle to dissociate. It might come to the same places. It might come to the same people thinking, isn't the body here? Isn't that me? And that identity is very hard to break. I'll perhaps come back to some of this and continue reading next week. I want to take a pause here with this last one. This is the most important, and perhaps I'll leave with this thought because it is such an important teaching to meditate upon. This is Master saying, he describes so much more suffering that the soul goes through with each stage of death. And then finally, after all the bullet points are over, he says, the suffering is purely mental when the mind realizes it cannot breathe or live in that body again. An imaginary sense of suffocation and pain at death turns into a painful mental nightmare, which for some time tortures the mental feeling of the dead man. But after a little while, when the soul has realized that the body is gone, it becomes reconciled. So I wanted to finish with that thought because I've thought about this quite a bit, especially because I've read these points many times before. Again, it may not yet be part of our realization, but rather than saying, I'm not the body, I have found this to be a much better affirmation that the suffering is mental, that the pain and suffocation that we are experiencing is actually imaginary. Because we cannot undo, suppress, or negate that pain, that fear. But we can affirm, because the truth is that there isn't any inherent reality to that pain and suffering, because this is just a transition from one world to another, and this is just a perpetual cycle that every soul goes through before it is liberated. So the pain that is experienced is a kind of loss, a loss of identity, a loss of body. There is a lot that accompanies that. But it is mental. There isn't actually a reason to suffer, except that we are constantly imagining that suffering as we go through those steps. So, easier said than done. but I find...
Very fast, though.
Sorry?
It's very fast. Yeah.
It's very fast.
I'm not feeling like, it's like days. I think it's very fast.
Well, I don't know from experience. It depends on the person, though, because if the person is aware, they can continue suffering even after separating from the body. If they don't go into deep stupor. If they have not descended into unconsciousness when they have separated from the body, when you're actually lingering, the suffering has not ended. Because it is still, he makes it sound like after a while, when the soul realizes the body is gone, it's like in the Festival of Light, we say, after a while, the tiny bird realizes. But, go ahead.
So I'm not sure how this fits in, but it's often said that in some circumstances where there's a sudden death happening, the soul leaves before the body is,
Yeah.
death happens. So this sort of doesn't go along with what you're reading. I think it's like the soul actually leaves and doesn't experience that suffering, or so it's.
Well,
So I don't. So this
Yeah.
is different than.
Well, I cannot comment from experience, but the way that is described generally is the reason why the soul leaves the body in case of sudden accident is because the pain of leaving relatively feels more tolerable than the pain of experiencing that shock through the physical body. So the soul chooses to step out, and there is again experiences where people say they saw their car being hit and them dying, because in their own, on a level that is deeper than the mind, there was a choice that was made that even if death was painful, it is not as painful as my body being traumatized by being crushed under a truck. So I'm going to step out. And perhaps in that relative scale, maybe you don't experience it in that same traumatic way. Just a guess. And like Atmajyoti pointed out, I do think it's very subjective. Because I'm also saying that not just from Master's teachings, because he didn't actually refer to it, but because I was reading in the last couple, because I was curious and interested, I was reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead. There's a lot more that happens, and they're not different teaching. There are direct correlations, since I'm not saying they're the same teaching. But Master and Yukteswar also talk about some of these things directly, which is what he's saying here. You are faced with your demons in a way that you're not faced when your consciousness is contained in the body. Now, whether that happens in those 30 seconds when you leave, whether that happens in the 3 hours when you leave, or it happens after you have dissociated from the body, but still you have not resolved that identity crisis. So, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, why I was mentioning it or referring to it right now, is because they start reading it only after the person has actually died. And then they talk about how now you're experiencing all of these things and how do you navigate that. So it's a question, honestly. I can't be too sure or, confident about what I'm saying. Go ahead, Leelavati.
I would think, and maybe I'm sure I've heard this somewhere, it's so individual.
Yeah, it is.
It depends on the person's karma. It depends on what the soul or the person needs to learn. It's an agreement between the soul and
Yeah.
the ego or this world. So
Yeah.
it's probably not clear cut for everyone.
Absolutely. And, we'll perhaps begin next week and we can start with a discussion around this also. We are not finishing because I want to have time for the activity. But Master talks a lot about that too, further in the same reading, where he also talks about, especially when people have prolonged illnesses or failing bodies, or even, you take somebody like Gyanamata, or somebody who just, people that die just saying joy, joy, joy. What are they experiencing? And do only fully liberated souls experience joy? I don't think so. I think those of us who are sufficiently evolved may also just be experiencing joy when you go through that process, because that process is not as painful as the limitation and the suffering caused by the body. I think, that's why it is subjective, because it's relative in a scale. But if you are somebody who is deeply attached and identified with experiencing certain pleasures and experiences through the body, then it is more likely to be that painful. Whereas, most often I had somebody very dear to me leave their body also, and I felt like I had an experience of them just 3 or 4 days after they had left. And the only feeling I had was one of, I wouldn't say joy, but one of relief, of very, very, very significant relief, and just real contentment and happiness, because the body was a burden that was really weighing down on the soul and holding back in a way that this person did not like. So, it is clearly very relative and subjective to what each soul goes through. I do want to continue this, and I think I know everybody in the room. I want to send the article that I mentioned, and we will start with this particular topic, maybe with the discussion next week before we dive into the topic for next week. I don't have an agenda except whatever is actually helpful for us to share and discuss in this context. But for now, I will invite. Go ahead. Yes, I will. There's a lot of people that have requested for the recording, so I will send the recording of the talk also.